Welcome everybody to the World Affairs Council of Orange County webinar program. Today we are honored to have as our guest speaker, Dr. Rebecca Lissner, who has just put out a new book entitled An Open World, How America Can Win the Contest for 21st Century Order. As I mentioned, I'm Serge Tomasian. I'm the past chairman and trustee, and so it's my pleasure to introduce this program. Our moderator today is Dr. Kyle Longley, director of the War and Society program and professor of history at Chapman University, which he recently joined after more than 2 decades at Arizona State University. He specializes in U.S. military history, U.S. foreign relations, and modern American politics. He is the author and editor of 9 books on topics ranging from U.S. Latin American relations to Southern politics and the American presidency. His most recent works include the prize-winning The Morenci Marines, a tale of a small town in the Vietnam War. And I know that he also worked at the LBJ Library in charge there as a director. He is also a prize-winning teacher, receiving of the Centennial Professorship for Outstanding Teaching by the Associated Students of Arizona State University. He's been made recently a trustee of our council. We're honored and pleased to have Dr. Longley as a member of our council, and he serves on the program committee. And so I'd like to welcome both Dr. Longley and Dr. Lissner. Her topic is very timely, where we are as a country and the change perhaps that's going to happen in our foreign policy. And so I'd like to now transfer it over to Dr. Longley and Dr. Lissner.
Thank you so much, Serge. I appreciate it. And I'm very happy to be here today. One of my first events with the Orange County World Affairs Council. Great honor to be here today. But the main honor today is being able to hear Dr. Lissner speak to us on, as has already been said, a very timely topic. And Dr. Lissner is an assistant professor in the Strategic and Operational Research Department at the U.S. Naval War College, and a non-resident scholar at the Georgetown University Center for Security Studies. She has also served in the U.S. government, including advisor to the Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Energy during the 2016 election cycle. A proud graduate of Harvard as well as Georgetown. She's written a number of articles and essays. But today we're going to be talking about her new book, co-authored with Dr. Rapp Hopper, and basically it's an open world, how America can win the contest for the 21st century order. So welcome, Dr. Lissner. We're very happy to have you here. And I'd like to start the questions today with basically the first one that starts on page 1. And I'm going to read you the quote, and I know you know it by heart, but for our colleagues, you say, and this is built around the 2016 presidential election, but you say a good starting point is addressing the issue of the quote, and again, related to page 1. On January 21st, 2017, the new president sketched a dark portrait of a country that had prioritized its international agenda at grievous self-expense. The American carnage could only be stopped by inward turn. The message was hardly subtle. The post-war foreign policy of the prior 70 years, rooted in free-flowing commerce, cooperative multilateral institutions, and robust alliances, was now slain. How is this your starting point for the creation of this book?
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you to you, Kyle, to Serge, and to the whole team at the Orange County World Affairs Council. I'm really delighted to be with you today. Having visited Orange County many times, I really love the area, and I know there are people from other World Affairs Councils as well. So thanks to all of you in the audience for taking the time to be a part of this conversation. And before we dive in substantively, I should say that I'm here speaking exclusively in my personal capacity, so the views that I present do not represent the Department of Defense, the Naval War College, or any institution with which I might be affiliated. But to get to your excellent kickoff question, Kyle, so our book, which is called An Open World, How America Can Win the Contest for 21st Century Order, really makes the case that the United States has to reimagine its foreign policy for a post-Trump, post-pandemic world before it is too late. And just as we write in those initial pages, my co-author Mira Rapp-Hooper and I began this book in the immediate wake of the 2016 election, when it was already clear to us that Donald Trump himself was more an avatar than an architect of the massive domestic and international changes that were reshaping American foreign policy. Because the fact is that even if Hillary Clinton had won way back in November 2016, she too would have had to contend with adverse global power shifts, rapid technological change, and acute domestic political dysfunction within the United States. So even as it is surely the case that Donald Trump's presidency has worsened America's global standing, it would be wrong to say that it is solely responsible for the collapse of American influence overseas and the failures of international cooperation that we've seen, particularly over the course of the past year in dealing with the COVID pandemic. And I would say that in many ways, recent events have tragically illustrated the central thesis of our book. The events of January 6th in the Capitol showed that American political dysfunction is becoming increasingly dangerous and untenable. And COVID has shown that an international system, an architecture of international cooperation that was in many ways built for the world of the 1940s is totally ill-equipped to meet the challenges and the opportunities of the 2020s, let alone the 2040s. So a new approach is required, and that's what our book sets out to do, having first mapped and investigated the long-term domestic and international trends that predated Trump, that predated the pandemic, but nevertheless anticipated the emergency that Washington now so obviously faces.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that answer. And I think it does set us up for the second question, because to me, as much as calling into question President Trump's foreign policy, you really seem to be calling into question the liberal international system that has existed really since, I would say to a degree, after World War I, but especially post-1945. Why do you, first of all, how would you explain that liberal internationalism to the audience? And then why would you say that the cleavages or fractures in that liberal international system require us now to look for a new order?
Sure, it is such an important question, and it may seem sort of academic or arcane, but in many ways it's fundamental to these conversations and debates that we're having in the United States right now about where the future of American foreign policy lies. So international order is a sort of academic scholarly concept, but it's one that's pretty intelligible. It refers to the rules, the laws, the norms, and the institutions that govern relationships between states, and in some cases organize competition or perhaps bound, or organize cooperation and perhaps bound competition or even conflict. And there have been many different types of orders throughout history. But after the Second World War is where I would date it, a new order began to emerge. It was called a liberal international order. That's what we've now come to call it. And it began with the ambitions that were enshrined in the UN system. Very quickly, as the Cold War began and the Iron Curtain descended, many of the liberal international order's aspirations about liberal politics and liberal markets were really confined to the Western Bloc. Of course, over time, the order evolved in response to the proliferation of new nations that came with decolonization and the need to respond to new challenges, as with the advent of the non-proliferation regime, which really embroidered upon the basis of the UN system that had already been established. In the 1970s, the International Economic Order listed with the demise of the gold standard and the challenge to the Bretton Woods institutions that had initially grown up. But it was really only with the fall of the Soviet Union that the United States came to feel that its liberal international ambitions could become universal. All of a sudden, liberal markets, liberal politics seemed inexorable, and the United States sought to spread them to every corner of the globe. And in many ways, that was the animating purpose of American foreign policy in the post-Cold War era, was to take these liberal tenets, to universalize them, and to bring all nations within a single liberal international order that was to be led by the United States. Now, the problem is that international order always reflects the distribution of power in the international system. And the distribution of power in the international system today has been changing for quite a long time. And the most important dimension of that change, I would argue, is the rise of China. Now, even as American foreign policy very much sought to bring China into the liberal international order, to convince Beijing to be a responsible stakeholder, quote unquote, in that order, the fact is that that wager did not bear out. China's increased participation in the international economic order and a globalized interdependent economy did not produce an increasingly more liberal political system within China. And in many ways, its economy remains quite illiberal as well. So we now have to confront the fact that we have an international order that does not really reflect the distribution of power. And even as China did rise within that order, it now seeks to revise that order to better reflect its power and preferences. And this is happening at a time where increasingly important dimensions of international life don't have any governance at all, whether we're talking about a sort of very minor climate change regime that is strictly voluntary at this point with the Paris Climate Agreement, or if we look at many dimensions of emerging technologies from biotech to AI to even cyber warfare, which really have no meaningful global rules. So we need to write new rules for the 21st century, even as we're going to do so in a time that is actually going to be much more geopolitically competitive, and therefore the authorship of those rules will itself be contested.
Right. Well, thank you. That's a wonderful synopsis of liberal internationalism. I need to incorporate you into my classroom. You do a much better job than I have. So I appreciate that answer. But it takes me to the other question, because it did come in your discussion. China is central to this book and the discussion of it. What is the greatest challenges of a closed order? You talk about open order. What's the dangers? And you can see some of this with regional hegemony and other things developing. What are the dangers if we were to backslide more toward what to a degree we've seen in our own foreign policy recently?
Sure. So let's start by just explaining what exactly is an open world, right? That's the title of our book, and that's the animating principle of the strategy that Mira and I put forth. So the openness strategy that's put forth in our book is a new foreign policy vision that sets out to defend American interests and values, even though, for all the reasons we just discussed, the United States is no longer the world's unrivaled superpower. And it recognizes that the United States can only stay safe, secure, and prosperous in an open world. So what does that mean exactly? It means first that all states should be able to make free and independent political choices without foreign interference in their domestic decision-making processes, and without outright domination by more powerful nations. It means second that international waterways, airspace, and outer space must all remain open and accessible for commercial and military transit. So countries like China or Iran should not be able to restrict or close off transit through important areas like the South China Sea or the Straits of Hormuz. And third, global cooperation and beneficial economic exchange should proceed through international institutions that are governed transparently and modernized for 21st century challenges. And what we argue is that in order to realize these three pillars of an open world, the United States does not need to dominate the world militarily in the way that in many ways we've set out to do in the post-Cold War era. What we need to do is prevent other countries from achieving that kind of dominance, while joining with like-minded allies and partners to build a powerful coalition for openness. And that's where China comes in. China is in many ways the chief antagonist to openness in the world, because it is the only country that both has preferences for closure and the capabilities to bring those preferences about. And when we think about what Chinese dominance or hegemony, especially in Asia, might look like, well, it might take on a sort of traditional geopolitical form whereby China sets out to territorially annex or use military force to expand its sphere of influence or even its own territory, or to establish some kind of empire or quasi-imperial structure. in Asia. It could look like the annexation of Taiwan through the use of military force. But it could also take subtler 21st century means, such as the use of economic development aid or the use of 5G digital infrastructure systems in order to coerce or suborn other countries to undermine their political independence and to advance Chinese interests. So we argue that such a world is certainly a more dangerous one, not only for the United States, but also for the world. And so that is why a focal point of this strategy is certainly pushing back against any bids for closure that China might mount.
Well, my follow-up question to that would be then, how would you advise the Biden administration to engage China within this open world?
So the flip side to everything I just said is, of course, the recognition that there are quite a few challenges, especially borderless challenges like climate change, like pandemics, that the United States can't solve on its own, that we can't solve if we just work with our close allies, and that in many ways actually require US-China cooperation in order to make progress. So part of what the openness strategy sets out to recognize is that the United States does need to find a way to live alongside a more powerful China. You can certainly find some people within the United States who think that it is within the United States capabilities and also really our mandate to set out to change the character of the Chinese regime. What we argue in the book is that it's really up to the Chinese people to decide what type of government, what type of regime they'd like to live under, and that the United States actually cannot influence the nature or the character of China in its own political system. So we have to hedge against the likelihood that until the Chinese people decide otherwise, the CCP is going to remain a repressive authoritarian regime that has many diverse interests that are at odds with the United States, even as we might have some areas where mutual interests do converge. So our strategy does not make any assumptions about the likelihood of benign Chinese intentions or the probability of harmonious cooperation, but we do argue that the United States should run very hard after those areas of mutual interest where the United States and China might be able to work together in order to advance mutual priorities, especially again on issues like migration, like climate change, and perhaps like global pandemics in the next phase.
Very well said. One of the major things that I saw in this book that jumped out to me was the emphasis on technology and technological advancement as a foreign policy. We don't oftentimes fold those two in together. Mm-hmm. But I was also struck by your argument about how we have lost sort of our way because the government and the tech industries have sort of gone in divergent paths, oftentimes undermining our own national security. So I that's a very broad question of the centrality of technology and its place in the world and what the United States could do better to make a more coherent policy that would allow us to better function in a global economy, a global geopolitical system.
So it is such an important question. I'm really glad that you asked it, because the fact is that technology is changing rapidly and it's transforming international politics. It's also transforming domestic governance, but neither American foreign policy strategy nor international governance has sufficiently kept up. So when we take a wide aperture view, it becomes clear that traditional measures of power like economic size or military capabilities surely remain important, but they don't tell the full 21st century picture. Because international influence over the coming decades is going to increasingly reflect countries' ability to innovate new technologies, to adopt those technologies for governmental and societal use, and to export those technologies for commercial as well as political gain. So you can think about how deploying sophisticated AI, for example, could allow countries to dominate commercial markets via superior products, or even generate military advantages by training fierce cyber weapons. But even as AI is prospectively such a potent force, it actually doesn't map neatly onto GDP or military power. You could think about a country like Israel, which has a very small market size or very small GDP, but nevertheless punches well above its weight when it comes to that type of technological power. So what that means within the United States is, in effect, to help advance the cause of openness, we need to do three things. The first is to set out to realign our domestic technology sector with the national interest. Whereas the United States spent upwards of 2% of GDP on research and development and basic science during the 1970s, during the Cold War, that number has now fallen well below 1%, is something on the order of 0.7% of GDP today. So the US federal government has a tremendous opportunity to make game-changing investments in R&D and basic science in ways that can bring the incentives of the private sector back into alignment with our national polity, especially by creating a market for them, by creating an ecosystem of innovation within this country, and also creating disincentives to go off chasing foreign market share in the way that they have been doing over the past several decades. A second thing the United States needs to do is learn to better leverage the technology of our allies. For all the reasons I just discussed, even if many of our allies in Western Europe or in Asia are lagging demographically and economically, they remain amongst the most technologically advanced industrial economies in the world. So there is quite a bit that our allies can bring to bear by way of technological power. And the United States needs to expand the way that it thinks about alliances and the burdens we share together for mutual defense to consider the ways in which technological burden sharing and pooling technological capabilities can help us do things like create cost-competitive alternatives to Chinese 5G infrastructure. And third, what we need to do is cooperate with coalitions of like-minded partners to write new rules to govern emerging technologies. There are today basically no global rules to govern cyberspace, like whether it is normatively acceptable to do cyber attacks on critical infrastructure of another country, or even to perpetrate cyber attacks like the SolarWinds attack that we saw recently. There are no meaningful rules about the use of your data when you use a foreign-owned app like TikTok. There are no meaningful global rules about the use of killer robots in warfare. So there's a vast domain of international life that remains effectively undergoverned, even as it is becoming more and more germane to our daily lives, particularly in our time of Zoom and remote work and so on. And so it is manifestly in the United States' interest to begin to craft new norms to regulate behavior in those spaces, even if those norms are not going to achieve universal buy-in or adherence. At least by joining together with like-minded countries and propagating open norms, we can make sure that closed norms or antithetical norms don't themselves crystallize.
Yes, wonderful response. That takes me into this. I think probably one of the areas we're going to see a major change with the Biden administration is moving back toward multilateral organizations. How do you see these middle powers playing out? You hinted at it, Japan, South Korea, the aging demography, but having significant technology. We could go across Western Europe as well as India. And I know you talk about this in the book. What is the best way to nurture these relationships and reintegrate the United States back into this sort of multilateral world?
So this conversation begins with the recognition that the geopolitical math is just not in the United States' favor if we act alone, right? China, its GDP is growing larger and larger, particularly over the last year and this coming year. We know that China will grow at a much, much higher rate, even as the United States actually will be contracting economically. And if you project the trend lines out, the United States position is going to be in decline in relative terms. And so the best hope that we have is to pool multilaterally the power not only of just ourselves, but also our allies. Because if you look at the combined GDP of the United States and its allies, it's actually something on the order of 27 times that of China. So we are exceptionally strong if we act together. So there are a few dimensions of what I think we need to do and what Mira and I argue in the book is necessary in order to really capitalize upon these efforts. One, of course, is modernizing our alliance system. We have a system of treaty alliances that were born in the early Cold War and that very much reflect those strategic imperatives. So we need to bring those alliances into the 21st century to make sure that the United States and our allies are equipped to handle 21st century threats and also to chase 21st century opportunities. We need to be able to deal with cyber threats. We need to help our European allies become more engaged with our Asian allies, particularly as the threat of China becomes more felt in Europe as well, and so on. Another thing we need to do is to build strong new partnerships. And here I think India is a really important example. India is not a treaty ally of the United States, but it is a really important partner, and a partner that seems to be showing increasing interest in working with us on at least some issues. Now, the some issues part is actually a really important point, because even as India is coming closer to the United States and to our preferences on, for example, security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific as a means of balancing against Chinese power, Chinese aggression against India, for example, in the Himalayas, India nevertheless has an illiberal streak at home, and the way in which it has handled internet governance domestically, for example, through prolonged internet shutdowns in Kashmir, actually looks much more like Chinese-style cyber sovereignty than it does like the United States' preference for an open internet. And so what that means is that we can't expect India to align with us exactly on every issue, but we should work really hard to capture it, because it will be a hinge state, and we should try to capture as much cooperation as we can with India on those elements of openness with which India agrees. And then the final point that I'd make is, in the foreign policy dialogue that you all might have heard recently, there's a lot of discussion about coalitions of democracies. And I think there's no question that democratic cooperation is going to be a focal point, should be a focal point for American strategy going forward. But we also need to be open-minded to the possibilities of cooperating with countries that are not themselves democracies when our interests align. So when you think about keeping freedom of navigation and open global commons in the South China Sea, the United States has a strong interest, for example, in cooperating with Vietnam, even though Vietnam is not itself a democracy. So the bottom line here is that the United States will be more potent and more effective if we cooperate with a wide range of allies and partners. And we should not be too picky about who those partners are. And when we do create new relationships, we shouldn't expect them to bridge across all issue areas, but rather we can pursue coalitions that are fit for purpose across a range of distinct political, economic, technological, security, and other domains.
In your last chapter, you do give these policy prescriptions, a number of which you've already highlighted. How would you sum it up and just sort of give it to the audience who may not have had the chance to read the book, these policy prescriptions? And I'm looking at a question here about what you think the Biden administration, how many of these policies in this open world do you think that they will follow?
So let me perhaps describe what the openness strategy would look like in implementation with reference to what the inheritance is from the Trump administration. And I would say that an openness strategy departs from President Trump's worldview and the foreign policy he sought to pursue in several fundamental ways. So first, where President Trump has resisted international cooperation and withdrawn from international agreements ranging from the Paris Climate Accord to the WHO, an openness strategy seeks to build a new architecture of international cooperation for the 21st century. So that means working hard to reform outdated institutions like the UN Security Council and the World Trade Organization. It also means, as we were just discussing, working with like-minded allies and partners to write new rules and build new cooperative institutions that are designed to address modern challenges, especially in the technological area where so few guidelines currently exist. Second, I would say where Donald Trump's administration has pursued a very militarized approach to US foreign policy, with something on the order of 200,000 troops deployed overseas and frequent threats to use military force, as well as massive investments in the defense budget. An openness strategy would actually make diplomacy and economic statecraft the leading instruments of US foreign policy. And that means really recognizing that the future of international competition will not be primarily military in nature. And that means practically investing in the revitalization of the US State Department while right-sizing the US military presence around the world. And finally, I would say that where President Trump has degraded America's capacity at home by stoking domestic divisions, undermining institutions, and really bungling the COVID response, an openness strategy recognizes the profound interconnection between America's domestic strength and its global leadership. So an openness strategy would therefore mount an effective COVID response through a coherent national strategy. It would seek to restore the integrity and legitimacy of American democracy, both in the eyes of the American people and in the eyes of the rest of the world. And it would seek to build consensus amongst members of both parties behind this reimagined vision of America's role in the world. So it's a large agenda. It cannot be accomplished probably in 4 years, in 8 years. It's really a generational mandate. And I think we need to be realistic that the Biden administration does come into office facing manifold crises that don't have to do with long-term strategy, but have to do with imminent threats to public health, climate change, racial justice, and this sort of brewing violent conflict within our own country about the consequences and result of the last election. And so all of these things are going to be really pressing challenges that will make long-term strategy very hard, but nevertheless, it remains exceptionally necessary.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good place to stop for us and to take questions from the audience. Like I say, I just tried to incorporate one of those into the questions, but I'm sure there will be more, and I'll turn that over right now to Rick.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Dr. Lissner. That was fascinating. And unusually, we don't actually have a tremendous number of questions coming in. I think that's testament to how comprehensively you've covered the subject. But I'll mention a couple specifically here. One question that we've heard before as well to other presenters is, should the U.S. immediately not ratify the UN Law of the Seas in order to take the moral high ground away from China and others as we deal with maritime transgressions?
Sure. Certainly in the book, we do recommend that the U.S. ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I don't know how optimistic I am about the political likelihood that that would happen, but certainly it would give the United States much better standing and much more moral authority and legal authority to have these conversations about attempts by countries like China or Iran to restrict freedom of navigation and commercial or military transit through vital waterways. Of course, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is customary international law, but I think the United States would be operating from a much stronger position if we actually did ratify the treaty.
And here's a direct question: what has been and can be learned from the Sino-Indian border conflict that affects the region? We've heard quite a bit about the events up in the fighting high up in the Himalayas, et cetera. How does that play out and affect that area?
So I guess I would highlight two upshots from that. One is a point that actually my co-author Mira made in a piece that she wrote a few months ago, the title of which was "China is Done Biding Its Time," right? There was this idea that Deng Xiaoping had suggested a hide and bide strategy whereby China would try to sort of remain under the radar as it grew increasingly powerful, trying not to attract too much attention to the fact of its rise. And in many ways, I think a number of Chinese behaviors over the course of the past year, to include its behavior in the Himalayas, show that China is feeling quite confident. It's feeling much more assertive, and it is demanding that other countries show much greater deference to it on account of its increased power. And so I would say that what we saw up in the Himalayas was part of a broader pattern of behavior that also included the crackdown on Hong Kong. It's also included much more assertive behavior vis-a-vis Taiwan. It's included China's behavior towards Australia, including cyber attacks on Australia, and so on. So that's part one. I think it exemplifies this new chapter in Chinese foreign policy that is burgeoning today. But the second part goes back to what Kyle and I were just discussing about India and the way in which India has sort of historically been thought of as a hinge state in the region. It's very important because it is on track to become one of the world's top 3 economies by 2050. And its recent skirmishes on its border with China, I think, have pushed it much more closely in the direction of the United States and also its cooperation with Australia and Japan and other countries than it had been previously. And so I think taking India from being sort of a hinge state to being firmly on the side of counterbalancing against China together with the United States in the Indo-Pacific is a really, really consequential development when you think about the long term. So I don't think war war is imminent between China and India, but I do think that these events have really awoken Indian leadership to the near-term threats and concerns and challenges that Chinese power does pose. And that presents a great opportunity for American foreign policy.
How true. China's sort of come off the rope-a-dope strategy and has wandered into the center of the ring a bit. One thing I'm just curious about, how, from a planning standpoint, how does a annexation of Taiwan play out in your mind? If you were to play that war game out, what happens there? And then how does the international community respond?
So it's interesting. I mean, this is very much on people's minds, and I've been getting this question quite a lot. And what's frustrating probably about the answer is that it's very much depends, right? You can imagine a wide range of different contingencies that begin with sort of the question of what has sparked this notional crisis. Has Taiwan declared independence? Has China just decided that Taiwan's time as a sort of quasi-independent, as an independent state is up? Has the United States changed its policy in some provocative way? So we need to know more about what the circumstances are in order to say much about how it would go and what the United States would do. What I will say is that the policy of strategic ambiguity, whereby the United States has declined to specify the conditions under which it would come to Taiwan's defense, has worked out quite well. It was actually one of the more genius turns, I think, in the history of American diplomacy. And I'm not sure that now is the time to abandon that approach. There are certainly things that the United States can do to ensure that the cross-strait power balance remains such that China doesn't think that it has a real window of opportunity that it should seize. But the other thing I would say is that we should be attuned to the many non-military ways that China can really squeeze Taiwan, and in many ways is already doing so. There are many things well short of a full-on amphibious invasion of Taiwan, to include a blockade, a naval quarantine, to include a number of economically coercive measures that China could take that would exert tremendous pressure on Taiwan, even without sending the PLA onto the island. So I would advise that we be attuned to those sort of what Thomas Schelling, the strategist, famously called sort of salami slicing tactics, or maybe you would think about it more like boiling the frog tactics, whereby China can actually ratchet up pressure on Taiwan in subtle ways that make a big difference, but don't have the spectacular and perhaps galvanizing effect of an actual military invasion.
Lastly, comments on from question from the audience: status of NATO in the future and U.S. leadership within NATO.
So this goes back to the conversation we had earlier about allies and partnerships. I mean, NATO is a tremendous and asymmetric asset that the United States does have. And I think it would be a tremendous mistake to walk away from it. That's not to say that NATO is entirely perfect as it is. There's quite a bit that we can and should do to modernize that alliance. For example, by facilitating more cyber threat information sharing amongst our allies, by helping to coordinate our responses to disinformation campaigns and election interference. A lot of these essentially 21st century threats that the alliance wasn't crafted to address, but nevertheless are very salient today. At the same time, there are these traditional threats that NATO could do a much better job of responding to. We know that Russia, even though it is in many ways a power in decline, has been sort of revanchist and often acts as a spoiler that causes trouble, whether it's through cyber attacks or perhaps through other means. And so NATO actually needs to do quite a bit of work to ensure that its forces have greater readiness so that they can deter and, if necessarily, defend against any kind of Russian invasion that could be in the offing of the sort of more traditional variety in the future. And then the last thing about NATO, and I believe I mentioned this earlier, is that the EU has recently recognized China as a quote unquote systemic rival. And I think there's really an awakening that has been happening in Europe about the threat that China does pose, not just far away, but in Europe itself, especially as the Belt and Road Initiative results in more Chinese investment on the continent. and so on. And so there's quite a bit that we can do to help NATO turn its attention to China, and also to integrate better with the United States Asian allies like South Korea, Australia, Japan, who really ought to be partners in a looser sense with our NATO allies as well. So there's a robust modernization agenda, readiness agenda, and so on that does lie ahead for NATO. And I believe it would be a really grave mistake to abandon that alliance at this juncture.
Quite agreed. Doctors Lissner and Longley, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Nora Valenzuela for closing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick. Thank you, Dr. Lissner, for very informative session. I was happy to hear that you were mentioning a number of different programs that we have recently actually introduced about NATO, AI, and a number of other programs that we've had. So really grateful on that. Thank you to Dr. Longley for being our moderator, and Serge and Rick as well. I'm really happy that you are emphasizing the importance of technology and the integration and the impact that it's having on our decision-making in the world of politics and international affairs. My background is in technology, so I did a lot of, and in recent months, I've been doing a lot of research and working both with the counties and states in terms of the digital divide, and why, as we move faster and faster in the field of technology, when our social services and our social policies are not moving in compliances, or at least in the same speed, a segment of our population may get ahead, and they may be aware of things, and they may make decisions, including reacting to things that is tweeted out, and a segment of the population is kept in dark. And how we need to be responsive in terms of responsible in terms of using technology. Technology is a tool, is certainly not a replacement for the human heart and human soul and our relationship to one another. So I'm very happy that you address a number of these areas. Thank you so much. We thank all of our guests. We had guests from all over. I noticed one of the questions came from Santa Barbara. They're a couple of hours away from us. So happy to have our audience from different places. We are going to have another event coming up next Thursday, and another one the following Thursday. So we actually have 3 events coming up this month. As an extension of our courtesy and thanking you for joining us, you are going to be an honorary member of the World Affairs Council of Orange County. And if you give us the honor and provide us the details, so the executive director can send you the information, and we would love to have you participate in our future events. And hopefully when we're all back in person, we will have the pleasure of having you in person and mingling with our trustees, members, and answering our questions in person. Thank you. And your baby stayed quiet in the other room, I noticed, huh? You were mentioning that he
yes,
may be.
they did, luckily.
You only have
Well,
one
thank you so much. It was really an honor to be with you, and I really appreciate your offer as well.
Thank you so much. And I'm encouraging everyone to certainly read your book and learn. And I am definitely going to get it myself and learn. So thank you very much. And I must say, I don't mean to be emphasizing your youth, but for such a young person, you're very knowledgeable. And I strongly recommend that many of our politicians and policymakers to pay attention to our academia and learn before they hold offices, so they can be a little bit more familiar with what goes on behind the human spirit in terms of their decision making. Just sharing all that historical knowledge and the breadth of knowledge was very helpful. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. Wishing you a wonderful afternoon and a great weekend, and enjoy your Monday holiday, Dr. Martin Luther King. Thank you, everyone. Bye.